A sick and weak Mustang, her ribs showing under her rough brown coat, was sold to a butcher for just a little money. Helpless and seen as worthless, her fate was sealed with a cold handshake. But what no one knew, not even the butcher, was that she was carrying a baby inside her. What the butcher did next surprised everyone. Stay with us for a powerful story of survival, change, and the surprising bonds that change everything. A sick and frail Mustang, her ribs pressing visibly against her dull chestnut coat, was sold to a butcher for a few meager coins. Weak and seemingly useless, she was deemed unworthy of care, her fate sealed with a cold handshake. But what no one realized, not even the butcher, was that she was carrying new life inside her. What the butcher did next shocked everyone. Stay with us for a powerful story of resilience, redemption, and the surprising bonds that change everything. The auction yard was a chaotic mix of loud voices, restless animals, and the pungent scent of hay and dirt. Buyers and sellers milled about, some striking deals with animated gestures, while others whispered in hushed tones. Among the crowd stood a thin, sickly Mustang, her head hanging low. Her chestnut coat, once vibrant and glossy, had lost its luster, now dull and patchy. Her legs trembled under her weight, and every breath was labored, rasping through her frail frame. The Mustang's eyes, large and dark, betrayed a quiet pain, as if she had already resigned herself to whatever cruel fate awaited her. She had been brought here by her owner, a farmer whose financial troubles outweighed his compassion. He had tried to nurse her back to health, but as her condition worsened, his patience waned. She was too sick to work, too weak to sell to a rider, and too much of a burden to keep. The auctioneer's voice boomed over the crowd, cutting through the noise. Lot 47, a Mustang mare, needs work, but she's sturdy enough for a practical use. His words danced carefully around the truth. The horse was sick, possibly dying. Start the bidding at $50. Who's in? The crowd fell silent for a moment, most turning their attention elsewhere. No one wanted a sick horse. She was too much trouble for too little gain. Just as the auctioneer began to lower the starting price, a man's gruff voice cut through the silence. 50. All eyes turned to a rugged figure standing near the edge of the ring. Tall and broad-shouldered, the man had a weathered face and cold, calculating eyes. His name was Marcus Hayes, a butcher known for his pragmatism and lack of sentimentality. Marcus didn't see a struggling horse. He saw pounds of meat. To him, this was just another business transaction. The auctioneer's gavel struck down, sealing the deal. Marcus handed over the money without a second glance at the animal. The farmer sighed in relief, pocketing the cash and stepping away from his burden. The Mustang was now the butcher's problem. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus led the mare to his truck, her hooves dragging across the ground with every reluctant step. He tied her securely, muttering to himself, "No use wasting time. You'll fetch something at least." The drive back to Marcus's facility was uneventful, the hum of the truck's engine drowning out the Mustang's weak whinnies. The butcher didn't look at her again. In his mind, her story was already over. She would be processed, and that would be the end of it. Arriving at the facility, Marcus parked in a gravel lot behind a large, nondescript barn. He untied the horse, her body trembling, as he led her into a holding pen. The space was dimly lit, with the scent of hay mingling with the metallic tang of blood. The Mustang's ears flicked nervously, her instincts screaming danger. Marcus took one last look at her, shaking his head. "You're worse off than I thought," he muttered, then turned to leave. But as he walked away, something caught his eye. The mare shifted uneasily, her swollen belly slightly more pronounced than he had realized. He paused, narrowing his eyes. Something didn't add up. "Couldn't be," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. A nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind as he locked the barn for the night. He brushed it off at first, chalking it up to his imagination. Yet, as he sat down to his supper, the image of the mare's swollen sides refused to leave him. The next morning, Marcus returned to the barn with his assistant, a young man named Daniel, who had just started working there. "Something's off about that horse," Marcus said gruffly as they approached the pen. "Check her over!" Daniel hesitated, unused to seeing his boss show any concern for the animals brought here. He nodded and entered the pen, approaching the Mustang with cautious steps. Her ears twitched as he neared, but she didn't shy away. A few minutes later, Daniel emerged, his face pale and eyes wide. "Boss," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "you're not going to believe this. She's pregnant." Marcus stared at him, his expression unreadable. "Pregnant?" he repeated, as if the word were foreign to him.
Yes, she's not just sick. She's carrying a foal.
For the first time in years, Marcus felt a twinge of something he couldn't quite name. Guilt? Compassion? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that the decision he now faced was unlike any he'd encountered before. He turned back toward the pen, watching the Mustang as she stood there, her head still drooping, but her body now a symbol of something more, a fragile hope, a flicker of life waiting to come into the world. "All right," Marcus said at last, his voice gruff but softer than usual. "We'll hold off, for now." Daniel nodded, a faint smile of relief crossing his face. The butcher walked away, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. What had started as a simple transaction was quickly becoming something far more complicated. And for the first time in years, Marcus Hayes wondered if there was more to his work and his life than just cold practicality. The butcher's truck rattled along the narrow dirt road, a thin trail of dust rising in its wake. The Mustang stood in the open trailer, her legs trembling with each bump. She didn't fight or neigh in protest. Her energy was long gone. Her glassy eyes stared blankly ahead, as if she had already accepted her fate. To her, it was just another moment in a string of hardships. Marcus, the butcher, glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. He wasn't cruel, but years of this business had hardened him. To him, every animal was the same, a way to earn a living, nothing more. "Poor thing," he muttered under his breath, though he didn't slow the truck. The sky had turned a pale gray by the time they reached his facility, a barn tucked away at the edge of the town. It was an ordinary place, with weathered wood walls and a faint metallic smell in the air. Marcus parked the truck and stepped out, walking around to the back. The Mustang's head hung low as he untied her, her breathing shallow and uneven. "Come on," Marcus grumbled, tugging gently at the rope tied around her neck. The mare stumbled forward, her hooves scraping against the wooden ramp. "One step at a time." As he led her into the barn, Marcus couldn't help but notice the slow, almost reluctant way she moved. He shook his head. "I don't know why I bother with the likes of you," he said, though there was no anger in his tone. "You'll barely fetch anything." Inside the barn, Marcus guided her into a holding pen. The space was dimly lit, with hay scattered across the floor and metal bars forming the walls. She stood in the corner, her legs trembling, her head barely lifted. Marcus sighed and locked the gate, then turned to leave. But as he reached the door, something made him stop. He turned back, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her again. Her sides seemed to rise and fall differently than other horses he'd worked with, almost as if there was something more going on. He frowned, pushing the thought away. "You're just worn out," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Nothing else." The next morning, Marcus returned to the barn, his assistant Daniel trailing behind him. Daniel was young, barely in his 20s, and eager to learn. He had taken the job to save up for college, though it was clear he wasn't comfortable with all aspects of the work. "Go check on that mare from yesterday," Marcus said as he busied himself with a clipboard. "Make sure she's drinking water." Daniel nodded and entered the pen. The Mustang stood motionless, her dull eyes fixed on the ground. As Daniel approached, she flinched slightly, but didn't move away. He crouched down, running his hand gently along her side. His brow furrowed as he felt the faint but unmistakable movement beneath her ribs. "Boss," Daniel called, standing quickly, "you might want to come look at this." Marcus grumbled under his breath, but set down the clipboard and walked over. "What is it now?" he asked, stepping into the pen. Daniel gestured toward the Mustang's belly. She's pregnant." For a moment, Marcus stared at the horse in silence. The words didn't fully register at first. Pregnant? He blinked and crouched down to get a closer look. Sure enough, her belly was slightly rounded, and when he placed a hand there, he felt it, a faint, rhythmic movement. "Well, he muttered, standing slowly. "Pregnant?" He rubbed the back of his neck, his mind racing. This changed everything. Selling her for meat was no longer an option, not with a foal on the way. Daniel watched him carefully. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Marcus didn't answer immediately. His first instinct was to get rid of the horse anyway, to avoid the extra trouble and expense. But as he looked at her, standing there so weak yet carrying the potential for new life, something inside him hesitated. "We wait," Marcus finally said. "We'll keep her here for now and see what happens. No sense rushing into anything." Daniel nodded, relieved. I'll make sure she has water and food." "Good," Marcus said, his tone gruff as he walked out of the pen. But even as he left the barn, he couldn't stop thinking about the mare. She had been sold to him as a lost cause, yet here she was, carrying something far more valuable than anyone had realized. Over the next few days, Marcus found himself visiting the barn more often than usual. He told himself it was to check on the business side of things, but deep down, he knew better. The sight of the Mustang, weak but quietly enduring, stirred something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of responsibility, maybe even guilt. He noticed how Daniel spent extra time with her, cleaning her pen and speaking to her in a soothing voice. The mare seemed to respond, her ears flicking toward him whenever he approached. Marcus shook his head whenever he saw it. "You're wasting your time," he muttered, but part of him couldn't help but admire the effort. One evening, Marcus stood outside the barn, leaning against the doorframe as the sun dipped below the horizon. He could hear the faint rustling of hay as the Mustang shifted in her pen. The weight of the decision he had made, and the one still to come, pressed heavily on his mind.
"This isn't what I signed up for," he muttered, staring out at the darkening sky. But even as he said it, he knew there was no turning back now. For the first time in a long while, Marcus Hayes felt something other than cold practicality. He didn't know what it was yet. Maybe hope, maybe regret, but he couldn't ignore it. The Mustang, weak and broken as she seemed, had changed something in him. And as the barn settled into quiet for the night, he wondered what the days ahead would bring. The barn was quiet in the early morning light, the faint sounds of rustling hay and soft breathing the only signs of life. The Mustang, now slightly more stable but still frail, stood in her pen. Her head hung low as she lazily chewed the fresh hay that Daniel had spread the evening before. She had regained a small amount of strength, but her frailty remained apparent in the way her legs trembled as she shifted her weight. Marcus entered the barn, his boots crunching against the dirt floor. He carried a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and a clipboard in the other, his usual morning routine. Yet, today felt different. Ever since Daniel had revealed the Mustang was pregnant, Marcus had been caught in a strange limbo. He was a man who prided himself on being practical, yet he couldn't bring himself to make a final decision about the horse. As he approached the pen, Marcus paused to observe her. The swelling in her belly was now more noticeable, a subtle but undeniable sign of the life growing inside her. He leaned on the wooden gate, sipping his coffee and staring at the mare as if searching for an answer. Daniel's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Morning, boss." The young assistant walked into the barn, his hands full with a bucket of water and a small container of grain. "She's looking a little better, don't you think?" Marcus shrugged, not wanting to admit he had noticed the same. Maybe, still a long way to go. Daniel set the bucket down and stepped into the pen. The Mustang flinched slightly, but didn't back away, a sign that she was beginning to trust the young man. He spoke to her in soft tones as he refilled her water and placed the grain nearby. She sniffed at it cautiously before beginning to eat. "You ever think about what'll happen to her?" Daniel asked, glancing over his shoulder at Marcus. The question caught Marcus off guard. He frowned, his grip tightening on the mug in his hand. "What do you mean?" "I mean, once she has the foal, what then?" Daniel straightened up, brushing his hands on his pants. "You're not planning to—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Marcus sighed heavily, setting his coffee down on the edge of a workbench. "I don't know yet. Haven't thought that far ahead." Daniel looked skeptical. "You've thought about it. You just don't want to say." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't sign up for this. I bought her for one reason. And now, everything's complicated." Daniel nodded slowly. "Maybe it's not as complicated as you think. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't about profit or plans. It's just about doing what feels right." Marcus gave a short, bitter laugh. "And what feels right is usually expensive. This business doesn't run on feelings." Despite his words, Marcus couldn't shake the sense that Daniel was right. He turned back to the pen, watching the mare as she ate. She was no longer just a sick horse. She was a mother-to-be, carrying something fragile and precious. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself distracted by thoughts of the mare and her foal. He left the barn several times to handle other tasks, but each time his mind wandered back. By mid-afternoon, he decided to call the local vet, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Hill, to take a closer look at the horse. When Dr. Hill arrived, she wasted no time getting to work. She was a woman of few words, her sharp eyes and practiced hands speaking for her. She moved around the Mustang with a calm efficiency, checking her vitals and examining her swollen belly.
"Well?" Marcus asked, his arms crossed as he leaned against the wall. "What's the verdict?" Dr. Hill straightened up, brushing her hands on her jeans. "She's pregnant, all right. Maybe 4 or 5 months along. The foal seems healthy, but the mare, she's in rough shape. If you want both of them to survive, you're going to need to put in some real effort." "What kind of effort?" Marcus asked, his tone cautious. "Better feed, regular monitoring, and probably a few supplements to boost her strength. It's not going to be cheap, and it's not going to be easy." She paused, her gaze narrowing. "But it's doable, if you care enough to try." Marcus felt the weight of her words. He looked at the Mustang, who stood quietly in her pen, her ears flicking occasionally, as if she were listening to their conversation. The thought of letting her die, along with the foal, gnawed at him in a way he couldn't explain. Dr. Hill packed up her supplies, giving Marcus a final glance. "It's your call, but if you're going to do this, you need to start now." After she left, Marcus stood alone in the barn, staring at the Mustang. Daniel's words from earlier echoed in his mind. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't about profit or plans. He sighed heavily and turned to Daniel, who had been quietly watching from the corner. "All right," Marcus said, his voice gruff but resolute. "Let's give her a chance." Daniel's face lit up with a smile. "You won't regret it, boss." "We'll see about that," Marcus muttered, though his heart felt lighter than it had in days. For the first time in a long while, Marcus Hayes was stepping into the unknown, not for profit, but for something far more valuable. And as he looked at the sick but enduring Mustang, he couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something better. The days that followed were unlike anything Marcus had experienced in years. His barn, usually a place of cold efficiency, was now filled with a cautious sense of purpose. The Mustang, whom Daniel had taken to calling Willow, began to show signs of life that Marcus hadn't expected. Willow's diet was carefully adjusted under the guidance of Dr. Hill. She was given nutrient-rich grains, fresh hay, and supplements mixed into her water. At first, she was hesitant, her head dipping into the feed trough, only to pull back as if unsure whether to trust this sudden kindness. But Daniel's patience won her over. Every day he spoke to her softly, his presence calm and reassuring. Slowly Willow began to eat without hesitation, her movements still shaky but with a hint of determination. Marcus watched from a distance, his arms often crossed, and his expression unreadable. He wasn't one for soft words or sentimental gestures, but he found himself drawn to the pen more often than he cared to admit. Each time he saw Willow standing a little steadier or finishing her food without pausing, something deep inside him stirred, a faint flicker of hope. One afternoon, as the sunlight streamed through the cracks in the barn walls, Marcus found Daniel brushing Willow's coat. The young man hummed a tune under his breath, his strokes gentle yet firm. Willow stood still, her ears twitching slightly at the sound. "She's looking better," Marcus said, stepping closer. Daniel glanced up, a faint smile on his face. "She is. I think she knows we're trying to help her." Marcus leaned on the gate, his gaze fixed on the Mustang. Her coat, though still dull in patches, had begun to regain some of its former sheen. The protruding ribs were less pronounced, and her breathing had grown steadier. Yet, Marcus knew there was still a long road ahead. "You really think she'll make it?" he asked, his voice low. Daniel nodded, his expression confident. "Yeah, she's tough, boss. You can see it in her eyes." Marcus looked at Willow's eyes, large, dark, and filled with a quiet resilience. He wanted to believe Daniel was right. For all his practical instincts, there was a part of him that was starting to care about what happened to this horse. That night, the barn was quieter than usual, the only sounds the faint rustle of hay and the soft whinnies of the other animals. Marcus sat on an overturned bucket near Willow's pen, a mug of coffee warming his hands. He stared at her, his mind wandering. He thought about the first time he'd seen her at the auction yard, frail and broken. Back then, she had been nothing more than another transaction, a means to an end. But now, she was something else, a symbol of perseverance, perhaps, or maybe a reflection of something he had lost in himself. "Funny how things change," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Willow shifted in her pen, her ears flicking toward the sound of his voice. For a moment, Marcus thought she looked at him,
not with fear or distrust, but with a quiet acknowledgement. He shook his head and took another sip of coffee. The turning point came a few days later. Daniel had been cleaning out Willow's pen when he noticed something unusual. Her belly, which had been steadily growing, moved in a way that made him stop and stare. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but then it happened again. A small, unmistakable shift beneath her skin. "Boss!" Daniel called out, his voice filled with excitement. "You've got to see this!" Marcus hurried over, his usual frown in place. "What now?" "Look," Daniel said, pointing to Willow's side. Marcus leaned in, his brow furrowing as he watched. Sure enough, there it was, a small, rhythmic movement, almost like a gentle ripple. It was the foal moving inside her. "Well, I'll be," Marcus muttered, his voice tinged with awe. He straightened up, scratching the back of his neck. "Guess it's really happening." Daniel grinned. "It's incredible, isn't it? A new life, right there." Marcus didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. For all his gruffness, he couldn't deny the strange sense of wonder he felt in that moment. Over the next few weeks, the changes in Willow became more pronounced. Her coat continued to improve, her strength returning little by little. She moved more freely now, her steps less wobbly, her head held a bit higher. Daniel often led her out of the barn into the small paddock nearby, where she could stretch her legs and graze in the open air. Marcus watched from the sidelines, his heart a strange mix of pride and unease. He wasn't used to feeling this way, to caring about something so fragile and uncertain. But as he saw Willow thriving, a part of him couldn't help but hope for the best. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Marcus stood by the paddock fence. Willow grazed quietly nearby, her swollen belly a reminder of the life she carried. Daniel stood beside him, his hands resting on the fence. "She's a fighter," Daniel said, breaking the silence. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the mare. "That she is." For the first time in years, Marcus Hayes felt something he thought he had lost. A connection, not just to the animals he worked with, but to the world around him. And as he watched Willow in the fading light, he realized that her fight was becoming his own. The barn sat quiet under the pale light of dawn, the world outside still shrouded in the early morning chill. Marcus stood at the barn door, watching the horizon as streaks of pink and orange bled into the sky. The quiet moments before the day began had always been his favorite, but today they felt different. He wasn't thinking about the day's work or his usual tasks. His mind kept drifting back to Willow and the journey that had brought her here. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the barn, Marcus walked inside. Willow was awake, standing near the edge of her pen. Her ears twitched as she noticed his presence, but she didn't shy away. Marcus approached the gate, leaning on it as he studied her. Her coat had a faint sheen now, and though she was still thin, she stood with more confidence than before. The foal's movement had become more noticeable, a subtle but constant reminder of the life she carried. "She's coming along," Daniel's voice broke the silence. Marcus turned to see the young man walking toward him, a bucket of fresh feed in his hand. "Morning," Daniel said, setting the bucket down and stepping into the pen. Willow watched him, but didn't move, her trust in him growing each day. Daniel placed the feed in her trough and gave her a gentle pat on the neck. "She's a tough one, isn't she?" Marcus nodded, though he didn't reply. His gaze lingered on the mare, his thoughts far away. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning everything he had built his life around. The business of slaughter had been practical, necessary even, but now it felt hollow. Willow's presence had awakened something in him he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of responsibility, not just for her survival, but for something greater. Later that morning, Marcus stepped outside the barn, the crisp air stinging his face. He walked toward the paddock, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. His mind wandered to his childhood, back to a time before the weight of adulthood had hardened him. He had grown up on a small family farm, surrounded by animals and open fields. His father had taught him how to care for the livestock, not just as resources, but as living beings deserving of respect. He remembered the first horse he had ever cared for, a spirited gelding named Rusty. Marcus had been no older than 10 when Rusty had been brought to the farm. The horse had been skittish and unruly, but with patience and care, Marcus had earned his trust. They had been inseparable for years, spending endless afternoons riding through the fields and woods. But life on the farm hadn't been easy. When a series of bad harvests left the family struggling, his father had been forced to sell Rusty to make ends meet.
Marcus had begged him not to, but there had been no other choice. Watching Rusty being led away had been the first time Marcus truly understood loss. It had been a defining moment, one that had shaped the man he would become. As he stood by the paddock, watching the sun climb higher into the sky, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if he had lost more than just a horse that day. Over the years, he had buried that part of himself, choosing practicality over sentiment. But now, as he watched Willow grazing in the distance, that old feeling began to resurface. Daniel's voice pulled him back to the present. "Boss, you all right?" Marcus turned to see him approaching, a curious look on his face. "You've been out here a while." "I'm fine," Marcus replied gruffly, "just thinking." "About her?" Daniel gestured toward Willow. Marcus hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, about her. And everything else." Daniel leaned against the fence, his expression thoughtful. "She's changed things, hasn't she?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out at the mare, her head lowered as she grazed. "I don't know what it is," he said finally, "but she's made me realize I've been doing this all wrong." Daniel looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This whole business. It's always been about making ends meet, doing what needed to be done. But maybe there's more to it than that. Maybe it's not just about survival." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "You're not the same man who bought her at that auction," he said quietly, "and that's a good thing." Marcus didn't reply, but he knew Daniel was right. The man who had bought Willow as a sick and worthless horse was not the same man who now stood here, questioning everything he thought he knew. And as he watched her, standing tall despite everything she had endured, he realized that she wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. And maybe, in her fight, he had found something worth holding on to. The day stretched on, filled with the usual tasks of feeding, cleaning, and maintaining the barn. But for Marcus, it felt different. He worked with a renewed sense of purpose, his thoughts no longer clouded by doubts. Willow had become more than just a responsibility. She was a reminder of what he had lost, and what he could still reclaim. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the barn in a warm, golden light, Marcus stood at the door, watching Willow in her pen. She turned her head slightly, her dark eyes meeting his for just a moment. And in that moment, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The quiet rhythm of barn life began to shift in subtle yet profound ways. Willow's presence had turned what was once a place of routine into something more alive. Her progress was slow but steady, her coat growing shinier and her movements less hesitant. Every small improvement felt like a triumph, and Daniel's dedication to her care only deepened the connection between them. It was early one morning when Marcus walked into the barn to find Daniel crouched by Willow's side, gently brushing her mane. The young man hummed a soft tune, his hands moving with careful precision. Willow stood still, her ears twitching occasionally at the sound. Marcus stopped in the doorway, watching them for a moment before clearing his throat. "You're here early," Marcus said, his voice gruff but without the usual edge. Daniel glanced up, a small smile on his face. "She seems calmer in the mornings. Figured it's a good time to get her used to being handled." Marcus stepped closer, leaning on the gate of the pen. "She's letting you get pretty close now." "Yeah," Daniel replied. "She's starting to trust us, I think. It's like she knows we're trying to help her." Marcus nodded, though he didn't say anything. He could see it too, the way Willow no longer flinched when Daniel approached, the way her eyes no longer darted with fear at every sound. She was still cautious, but there was a growing calmness about her, a quiet acceptance of her new surroundings. As the days passed, Marcus found himself spending more time in the barn, not just to oversee the work, but to observe Willow. He often stood silently by the gate, watching as Daniel fed her or led her out into the paddock. There was something about the way the young man interacted with the mare that reminded Marcus of himself as a boy, back when he still believed in the bond between humans and animals. One afternoon, Marcus decided to step into the pen himself. He wasn't sure what compelled him, curiosity, perhaps, or the desire to see if Willow would accept him the way she had accepted Daniel. As he entered, she lifted her head, her dark eyes following his movements. For a moment, she tensed, her ears flicking back. Marcus froze, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Easy there," he said softly, his voice lower than usual. "I'm not going to hurt you." Willow's ears swiveled forward slightly, and she relaxed just a little. Marcus reached out a hand, stopping a few inches from her muzzle. She hesitated, sniffing the air before leaning forward to touch his hand with her nose. The contact was brief, but it was enough to make Marcus feel a strange sense of accomplishment. "She likes you," Daniel said from outside the pen, his tone teasing but warm. Marcus smirked, stepping back slowly. "She's tolerating me, that's all."
"Give it time," Daniel replied. "She'll come around."
Over the following weeks, the bond between Willow and her caretakers grew stronger. Daniel continued to spend hours with her each day, brushing her coat, talking to her, and leading her on short walks around the paddock. Marcus, though less outwardly affectionate, found himself drawn to her quiet resilience. He began to bring her treats, an apple here, a handful of fresh grass there, and each time she greeted him with a little more trust. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the barn in warm, golden light, Marcus stood by Willow's pen, holding an apple in his hand. She approached him cautiously, her ears flicking forward. He held the apple out to her, his hand steady. She sniffed it, then took a tentative bite.
"You're a stubborn one," Marcus said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But I guess I can't blame you for that."
Willow chewed the apple slowly, her dark eyes meeting his for a moment. It was a small gesture, but to Marcus it felt like a turning point. He realized that he wasn't just caring for her out of obligation anymore. He cared because she mattered, to him, to Daniel, and to the life she carried inside her. That night, as Marcus sat by the fire in his small house near the barn, he found himself thinking about Willow and the bond that had begun to form between them. He thought about her resilience, her quiet strength, and the way she had started to trust him, despite everything she had been through. For the first time in years, Marcus felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the practicalities of his work. He didn't just want to see Willow survive, he wanted to see her thrive. By the time he returned to the barn the next morning, his resolve had solidified. He would do whatever it took to ensure Willow and her foal made it. The business, the costs, the challenges, they didn't matter as much as they once did. What mattered now was the bond they were building and the life they were working to protect. As he stood in the barn, watching Willow graze in the paddock with the morning light streaming through the trees, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope for Willow, for her foal, and perhaps even for himself. The days in the barn had settled into a steady rhythm. Willow continued to grow stronger, her coat regaining its shine, and her belly swelling noticeably with the life she carried. Each day brought her closer to the inevitable moment of giving birth, and with it came a growing sense of anticipation. But with progress came challenges, and the road ahead was far from easy. One morning, as the first light filtered into the barn, Marcus found Daniel standing outside Willow's pen, his brow furrowed. Willow was restless, shifting her weight from one leg to the other and pawing at the ground. Her ears flicked back and forth, and her nostrils flared with each sharp exhale. "She's been like this since last night," Daniel said as Marcus approached. "I thought it might be the usual jitters, but it's different this time." Marcus studied Willow carefully. Her usual calm demeanor had been replaced with unease, and her movements seemed strained. He stepped closer to the pen, leaning on the gate. "She's not due yet, is she?" he asked, though the concern in his voice was evident.
Daniel shook his head. "Not for a couple of weeks. Something's wrong."
Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his phone and called Dr. Hill. The vet arrived within the hour, her expression serious as she examined Willow. The barn was silent except for the sound of her tools and the occasional soft snort from the mare. Marcus and Daniel watched from a distance, their anxiety growing with each passing minute. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Hill stood and wiped her hands on a cloth. "She's stressed," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Could be a number of things, her condition before she came here, the pregnancy itself, or even the change in her environment. The good news is the foal's still doing fine, but if we don't address this, it could cause complications." "What do we need to do?" Marcus asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Dr. Hill glanced between him and Daniel. "First, we need to keep her calm, minimize noise and movement around her, make sure she has plenty of fresh water and a consistent feeding schedule, and I'll leave you some supplements to help with her energy levels." Marcus nodded, his mind already running through the logistics. "We'll do whatever it takes." Dr. Hill handed him a list of instructions. "I'll check back in a few days. If anything changes, if she gets worse, or if the foal stops moving, call me immediately." As the vet packed up her things and left, Marcus turned to Daniel. "We've got work to do." For the next few days, Marcus and Daniel followed Dr. Hill's instructions to the letter. They reduced noise in the barn, kept Willow's pen clean and comfortable, and ensured she had constant access to water and fresh feed. Marcus even went so far as to rearrange his schedule, spending more time in the barn to keep an eye on her. Despite their efforts, the tension in the barn was palpable. Willow's restlessness persisted, though it lessened slightly as the days went on. Marcus found himself watching her for hours, searching for any sign of improvement or further distress. It was exhausting work, but he couldn't bring himself to leave her side. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus sat on an old stool near Willow's pen. The barn was quiet except for the soft rustling of hay and the faint sounds of the other animals. Willow stood in her usual spot, her ears twitching occasionally as she watched Marcus. "You're a tough one," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen a lot of animals come and go, but none quite like you." Willow flicked her ears in his direction, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've got me talking to a horse. Never thought I'd see the day." Daniel walked in a few minutes later, carrying a bucket of fresh water. "How's she doing?" he asked. "Better, I think," Marcus replied. "At least she's not pacing as much." Daniel nodded as he set the bucket down. "She'll pull through. She's stronger than she looks." "I hope so," Marcus said, his gaze still fixed on Willow, "because I'm not sure I can handle losing her." The admission surprised even him, but he didn't regret saying it. Willow had become more than just a horse to him. She was a symbol of everything he had come to value over the past few months. Her survival mattered, not just for her own sake, but for his as well. As the days turned into weeks, Willow's condition stabilized. She was still restless at times, but the supplements and careful attention seemed to be making a difference. The foal's movements grew stronger, and Dr. Hill confirmed that both mother and baby were doing well during her next visit. Despite the progress, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time. He knew the risks involved in a pregnancy like Willow's, especially given her history of neglect. But he also knew that they had come too far to give up now. One night, as Marcus stood outside the barn, looking up at the star-filled sky, he made a silent promise to Willow, to her foal, and to himself. Whatever it took, he would see this through to the end. They had faced so many challenges already, and he wasn't about to let anything stand in their way now. The barn had become a place of quiet determination. Each day brought Marcus and Daniel closer to a goal that had felt impossible only weeks before. Willow's progress had been slow but steady, her strength returning as her belly grew rounder. The signs of life within her were undeniable now. Gentle kicks that rippled across her side, a steady rhythm of hope that neither man could ignore. Marcus had changed in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The gruff, pragmatic butcher who had once seen animals as commodities now spent hours ensuring Willow's comfort. He had never imagined himself this way, kneeling in the dirt to adjust her bedding, measuring out supplements with precision, or sitting quietly by her pen, speaking in low tones to reassure her. One afternoon, as Marcus was cleaning out Willow's pen, Daniel approached with a small grin. "You know, boss," he said, leaning on the gate, "you've got a knack for this." "For what?" Marcus asked, without looking up. "Taking care of her. It's like you've done this your whole life." Marcus snorted. "I used to, a long time ago." He paused, leaning on his shovel and looking at Willow, who was grazing on fresh hay. "I guess I just forgot how." Daniel's smile softened. "Well, you're remembering now." The words stuck with Marcus long after Daniel left the barn. He thought about his past, about the boy who had once cared deeply for animals, who had seen them as more than just tools or burdens. That boy had disappeared somewhere along the way, buried under years of hardship and practicality. But now, with Willow and her unborn foal, Marcus felt like he was rediscovering something he had lost, a part of himself he thought was gone forever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus stood outside the barn, gazing at the glowing sky. Willow had been more restless that day, her movements slower, her breaths heavier. Dr. Hill had assured them it was normal at this stage of her pregnancy, but Marcus couldn't help the gnawing worry that lingered in the back of his mind. Daniel joined him a few minutes later, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He handed one to Marcus and leaned against the fence. "You think she knows?" Daniel asked, nodding toward the barn.
Knows what? Marcus replied, taking a sip.
That we're trying to help her. That we care. Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring at the barn door. Maybe. Animals are smarter than we give them credit for. They can sense things.
Daniel smiled faintly. I think she does. She's calmer now, you know? Like she trusts us. Marcus nodded. She's come a long way.
So have you, Daniel added, his tone gentle but firm. Marcus looked at him, surprised. What's that supposed to mean? It means you're not the same man who brought her here, Daniel said. You've changed, boss, and it's a good thing. Marcus didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared into his coffee, the steam rising in the cool evening air. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. Maybe. Or maybe she's the one doing all the changing. The days blurred together as the countdown to Willow's due date grew shorter. Marcus and Daniel worked tirelessly to ensure she had everything she needed. They fortified her pen, added extra bedding, and kept the barn as quiet and calm as possible. Dr. Hill visited regularly, checking on Willow and offering advice. Each time she left, Marcus felt a little more confident, but also a little more anxious. One night, as Marcus sat by Willow's pen, he found himself talking to her again. "You've made a fool out of me, you know that?" he said, his voice tinged with humor. "A few months ago, I'd have laughed at the idea of sitting here, worrying about a horse. But now—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Now, I can't imagine it any other way." Willow flicked her ears in his direction, her large dark eyes meeting his for a brief moment. Marcus chuckled softly. "Yeah, I guess we're in this together, huh?" The bond between Marcus and Willow deepened with each passing day. He began to notice the small details, the way her ears flicked toward him when he entered the barn, the soft nicker she let out when she recognized his voice. She had stopped flinching when he approached, her trust in him evident in the way she allowed him to touch her without hesitation. One evening, as Marcus and Daniel led Willow out into the paddock for some fresh air, Daniel turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "What are you going to do after this?" "After what?" Marcus asked, keeping a steady hand on Willow's halter. "After she has the foal. What happens then?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know one thing. I'm not letting her go back to the life she had before. She deserves better." Daniel nodded, a small smile on his face. "She's lucky to have you." "No," Marcus said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm the lucky one." As the sun set over the paddock, casting the world in shades of gold and amber, Marcus stood beside Willow, his hand resting on her neck. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving towards something meaningful. Willow had changed him, had reminded him of the man he used to be, and the man he could become. In her quiet strength, he found redemption, and in the life she carried, he found hope. The air in the barn was heavy with anticipation as the night deepened. The usual sounds of rustling hay and the occasional whinny of nearby animals were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. Willow stood in her pen, shifting her weight from one leg to the other. Her breaths were heavy and uneven, and her ears twitched at every small noise. Marcus sat on a stool near the gate, his elbows resting on his knees and his hands clasped tightly. His gaze never left Willow, watching her every move for signs of what was to come. Daniel paced behind him, his boots scuffing the dirt floor as he muttered to himself. "I don't know, boss," Daniel said, his voice tinged with worry. "She seems off. Should we call Dr. Hill again?" "She said this would happen," Marcus replied, his tone steady but tense. "She's close, that's all." "Yeah, but what if—" "She'll be fine," Marcus interrupted, more firmly this time. "She's tougher than she looks." Despite his words, Marcus couldn't shake the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He had spent months preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, he felt helpless. Every part of him wanted to do something, anything, to make it easier for her, but all he could do was wait. As the hours dragged on, Willow's discomfort grew. She pawed at the ground, her nostrils flaring with each labored breath. The movements in her swollen belly were more pronounced now, visible even from a distance. Marcus stood and stepped closer to the pen, his hands gripping the top rail of the gate. "You've got this," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just hang in there!" Daniel stopped pacing and moved to stand beside him. "What do we do if something goes wrong?" Marcus glanced at him,
his jaw tightening. "We don't think like that. Not now."
Daniel nodded, though the worry in his eyes didn't fade. Suddenly, Willow let out a low, guttural sound and lowered herself to the ground. Marcus's heart raced as he watched her settle into the straw, her body trembling with effort.
"It's starting,"
he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Get the supplies." Daniel sprinted to the workbench where they had prepared towels, clean water, and everything Dr. Hill had advised them to keep on hand. Marcus stepped into the pen, kneeling a few feet away from Willow. He didn't dare get too close, not wanting to add to her stress, but he stayed near enough to offer comfort. "You're doing great," he murmured, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Just keep going." The next hour felt like an eternity. Willow's breaths came in harsh, uneven bursts as she strained against the pain. Marcus and Daniel worked silently, their focus entirely on the mare. The barn was filled with tension, the air thick with anticipation and worry. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, a small, wet shape emerged into the world. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding as he reached for the towels, handing one to Daniel while keeping another for himself. The foal lay motionless for a moment, its tiny sides heaving as it took its first breaths. "It's a colt," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes were wide with awe as he gently wiped the foal clean. Marcus knelt beside Willow, his hands steady as he worked to ensure the foal was breathing properly. He glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You did it," he said softly. "You really did it." Willow lifted her head, her dark eyes full of exhaustion, but also something else, a quiet, undeniable pride. She let out a soft nicker, nudging the foal with her nose as he began to stir. Marcus stepped back, giving her space to bond with her newborn. The colt wobbled slightly as he attempted to stand, his tiny legs trembling beneath him.
"Look at him," Daniel said, his voice filled with wonder. "He's perfect."
Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He watched as the colt finally found his footing, standing on unsteady legs and taking his first steps toward Willow. She nuzzled him gently, her soft whinnies filling the barn. The sight was almost too much for Marcus to bear. He turned away for a moment, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. He hadn't cried in years, but something about this moment, the sheer miracle of it, broke through the walls he had built around himself. "Boss," Daniel said, his voice pulling Marcus back. "You okay?" Marcus nodded, his voice rough as he replied, "Yeah, I'm okay." The two men stood in silence, watching as Willow and her colt settled into a rhythm. The foal nursed hungrily, his tiny body pressed close to his mother's. Willow's ears flicked forward, her eyes half closed in contentment. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the barn walls, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The journey that had started with a sick, unwanted horse now felt like the beginning of something new, something better. For the first time in a long while, Marcus Hayes believed in the possibility of redemption. And as he looked at the mare and her foal, he realized that they had given him something he hadn't even known he needed: hope. The morning after the colt's birth dawned bright and cool, the golden light spilling through the cracks in the barn walls. Willow stood in her pen, her head low, but her posture proud, as her newborn colt nursed beside her. Marcus leaned on the gate, a mug of coffee in hand, his face soft with an expression rarely seen. The scene before him felt surreal, almost sacred. Daniel walked in, his boots scuffing lightly against the dirt floor. He stopped beside Marcus, his eyes immediately drawn to the colt. "Morning, boss," he said quietly. "How are they doing?" "Better than I expected," Marcus replied, not taking his eyes off the pair. "She's tougher than I gave her credit for."
Daniel chuckled. "We knew that the day she stepped off your truck."
The two men stood in companionable silence, watching as the colt wobbled on his spindly legs, occasionally losing his balance and plopping back onto the straw. Willow nuzzled him gently, her soft whinnies encouraging him to try again. It was a simple yet profound display of resilience, a reminder of the strength found in new beginnings. As the days passed, the barn became a hub of activity. Marcus and Daniel worked tirelessly to ensure Willow and her colt had everything they needed. The colt, whom Daniel had named Sparrow for his small yet spirited nature, grew stronger with each passing day. His once uncertain steps became bolder, his energy boundless as he explored the confines of the pen. Marcus found himself spending more and more time in the barn, not out of obligation,
but out of a genuine desire to be near them. He often brought an apple or a handful of fresh grass for Willow, his gruff demeanor softening as he spoke to her in low tones. She had come to trust him completely, greeting him with a quiet nicker whenever he entered the barn. One afternoon, as Marcus cleaned out Sparrow's pen, Daniel leaned on the gate with a thoughtful expression. "You've changed, you know," he said. Marcus paused, glancing over his shoulder. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You're different. When I started working here, you were, well, let's just say you weren't exactly sentimental." Marcus smirked, returning to his task. "Maybe I just needed the right horse to remind me how." Daniel nodded, his grin widening. "I think they've done more for you than you've done for them." Marcus straightened, tossing a final forkful of soiled straw into the wheelbarrow. "Maybe they have." As Sparrow grew, so did the bond between Marcus and Willow. The mare had become more than just a project or a responsibility. She was a part of his life now, a symbol of everything he had rediscovered. She had reminded him of his younger self, of the boy who had once loved animals for their spirit and beauty, not just their utility. But with that bond came a new sense of purpose. Marcus began to see his work differently, not as a means to an end, but as an opportunity to make a difference. He thought about the countless animals he had seen over the years, the ones who hadn't been as lucky as Willow. For the first time, he wondered if he could do more. One evening, as he sat with Daniel in the barn, watching Sparrow doze beside his mother, Marcus voiced the thought that had been growing in his mind. "I'm thinking about making some changes around here." Daniel looked at him, curious. "What kind of changes?" "I've been in this business a long time," Marcus said, his voice thoughtful. "And I've always done things one way, the practical way. But maybe it's time to try something different." Daniel leaned forward, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" "Sanctuary," Marcus said simply. "A place for horses like her, ones who didn't get a fair shot." Daniel's eyes widened. "You mean, no more butchering?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, no more butchering." For a moment, Daniel didn't say anything, his mind racing with the implications. Then he smiled. "I think that's the best idea you've ever had." The decision wasn't easy, but it felt right. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began laying the groundwork for the transition. He reached out to Dr. Hill for advice, contacted local horse rescue groups, and started planning the logistics of turning his facility into a haven for animals in need. The process was slow and daunting, but Marcus faced it with a determination he hadn't felt in years. Willow and Sparrow had shown him what was possible when compassion replaced practicality, and he was committed to building something that honored that lesson. One evening, as the sun set over the paddock, Marcus stood by the fence, watching Sparrow chase after a butterfly. Willow grazed nearby, her movements calm and deliberate. Daniel joined him, leaning on the fence with a grin. "They look happy," Daniel said. "They are," Marcus replied. "And so am I." Daniel glanced at him, his expression warm. "You've done something good here, boss. Something real." Marcus nodded, his gaze never leaving the pair. "I didn't do it alone." The two men stood in silence, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the paddock. For Marcus, the journey had been one of redemption, a second chance to do things right. And as he watched Willow and Sparrow, he knew that this was only the beginning. The crisp morning air carried a quiet calm as Marcus stood by the paddock fence, watching Sparrow gallop across the open field. His tiny legs moved with boundless energy, his glossy coat catching the golden light of the rising sun. Willow followed him at a steady pace, her steps confident and graceful. She no longer bore the frail, defeated look of the horse Marcus had brought home months ago. Now, she stood tall, her head high, a testament to the strength and resilience that had carried her through so much. Marcus rested his arms on the fence, a faint smile playing on his lips. He could feel the warmth of the sun on his face, but it was the sight before him that filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Beside him, Daniel leaned on the fence, his expression a mix of pride and awe. "They're something, aren't they?" Daniel said, breaking the silence. Marcus nodded. "They are. She's come a long way." "And so have you," Daniel added with a grin.
Marcus chuckled softly. "Maybe."
The transition from butcher to sanctuary owner had been anything but easy. Marcus had faced skepticism from those who knew him, questioning why a man so rooted in practicality would suddenly decide to change his entire life's work. But for Marcus, the answer was simple. Willow had changed him. She had shown him that it wasn't too late to make a difference.
to choose compassion over convenience, and to find purpose in something greater than himself. The sanctuary, though still in its early stages, was beginning to take shape. Marcus had worked tirelessly to convert his facility, clearing out the equipment and replacing it with spacious pens, clean stalls, and open grazing areas. Dr. Hill had been instrumental in helping him design the space to ensure the horse's health and safety, and several local volunteers had stepped forward to lend a hand. Word of Marcus's transformation had spread, and donations began to trickle in. People who had once dismissed him as cold and unfeeling now saw him in a new light. He had become a man of integrity, someone who had chosen to do the right thing even when it wasn't easy. One afternoon, as Marcus was working on repairing a section of the fence, a truck pulled up to the barn. A woman stepped out, holding the lead rope of a skittish mare. Her eyes were filled with worry as she approached Marcus.
"I heard about what you're doing here," she said, her voice tinged with hope. "I didn't know where else to go. She needs help."
Marcus looked at the mare, her coat dull and her ribs visible beneath her thin frame. He saw a familiar fear in her eyes, the same fear Willow had once carried. He stepped forward, his voice calm and steady.
"She's in the right place."
The woman's face softened with relief, and Marcus led the mare toward an open stall. As he worked to settle her in, he couldn't help but think of Willow. This was what it was all about, giving these animals a second chance, just as she had given him one. That evening, Marcus stood in the paddock, watching Willow and Sparrow graze under the fading light of the setting sun. The colt had grown stronger with each passing day, his playful energy infectious. Willow, ever patient and steady, stayed close to him, her eyes calm and content. Marcus leaned against the fence, his thoughts drifting to the future. The sanctuary was just the beginning. He wanted to do more, to save as many horses as he could, to create a legacy that honored the lessons Willow had taught him. Daniel joined him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Marcus, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. "You ever think about where she'd be if you hadn't brought her home that day?" Daniel asked. "Every day," Marcus replied. "And every day, I'm thankful I did." Daniel smiled. "You gave her freedom, boss. You gave her a life." Marcus shook his head. "She gave me more than I ever gave her." The 2 men stood in silence, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. Willow lifted her head, her dark eyes meeting Marcus's for a brief moment. In that glance, he saw everything: her gratitude, her strength, and the unbreakable bond they had forged. The following morning, Marcus opened the gate to the larger field, allowing Willow and Sparrow to roam freely. He watched as they trotted out together, their silhouettes framed by the rising sun. Sparrow's excited whinnies echoed through the air as he darted ahead, and Willow followed at her own pace, her movements calm and assured. As they disappeared into the open field, Marcus felt a bittersweet pang in his chest. They were free now, truly free, and while part of him would miss the closeness they had shared, he knew this was what they deserved. He turned to Daniel, who stood beside him, his hands resting on the gate. "This is what it's all about," Marcus said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, it is." For Marcus, the journey had been one of redemption, of finding a purpose he hadn't known he was searching for. And as he walked back toward the barn, the morning sun warming his back, he knew that this was only the beginning. Willow and Sparrow had taught him that life was about more than survival. It was about hope, connection, and the courage to start over. And for the first time in years, Marcus Hayes felt truly alive.